Well, welcome to the 2020 Watershed Congress. The Watershed Congress is organized by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network in collaboration with many other organizations, including my own at Stroud Water Research Center. My name is Vandy Nix, Watershed Education Specialist at the Stroud Center and member of the Watershed Congress Organizing Committee. I am also your moderator for this panel-style session, The Stories That Shape Us, Bridging Barriers to Environmental Justice in Climate-Resilient Communities through intergenerational storytelling. Many of us here tonight are experiencing a shared feeling, urgency to find resolution in a global pandemic. COVID-19 is a daily source of fear and a daily reminder of this chasm between those of us most prepared and privileged to weather that storm and those of us most vulnerable to it. So we're feeling urgency to act on that, urgency on human accelerated and human caused climate change, which like pandemic disproportionately harm our economically disadvantaged communities and our Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples of color. But we're also feeling another urgency to rebuild something, anything better, to create an environmentally sustainable and equitable legacy for all of our generations. And so tonight, I am so pleased to announce 5 panelists representing 5 generations in the environmental movement. First, we have Fred Lewis, who represents the silent generation born between 1928 and 1945. So they're often overlooked and lodged right between the greatest generation or the GI World War II generation, but just before the baby boomers. Their namesake comes from the great silent majority that Nixon referred to describe the middle Americans that he believed were drowned out by the loudest voices in the media, the more progressive minority. But this is a generation that was not so silent. They did pioneer movements like the Civil Rights Movement. We also have here tonight, Eleanor Lundy-Wade. She represents the baby boomer generation, born anywhere from 1946 to 1954 as part of that post-World War II baby boom. And they did grow up as television exploded into American homes with a lot of the other events and countercultures that followed. We also have Bethany Ayers Fisher, representing Generation X. This generation was born between 1965 to 1980, when they grew up with the computer revolution and sometimes were referred to as the latchkey generation, because they were experiencing a time when more mothers joined the workforce, divorce rates were increasing, and childcare options at the same time outside the home were not quite yet as widespread. So this generation has been defined greatly based on their economic vigor and also experiencing a lot of energy crisis and other phenomena. Of course, and excitingly, we have Joey Rodriguez, who represents our Generation Y and the Millennial generation, to which I also belong. This generation is born between 1981 to 2006, or I'm sorry, 1981 to 1996, because they grew up with the internet explosion. They often are noted right here as the cutoff, as the last of the living generations today to distinctly remember and be personally affected by the events of 9/11. We also have here Samira, who represents our Generation Z, the youngest generation born between 1997 to roughly 2012. And although she is still in high school, she is already well on her way to leaving the world better than she found it. And so what's exciting about all of these generations here is that together, they each are kind of functioning like a tributary and a watershed. So the headwaters from which each of them originate may be very different from one another, and they might encounter very different pollutants and barriers as they flow over the surface of the earth, some of those barriers far worse than others, but each of them spills into a body of water shared by all of us. And so environmental inequities like climate change and pollution protections, they don't only poison one tributary, they poison the watershed of the collective. And we experience this on a global scale. And so much like water, it is our stories that are the lifeblood of our humanity. Our stories reflect us, nourish us, sustain us. And stories like water are a driver of human exploration and socialization. We seek out more quality stories, just like the reason we're all here tonight, because they help us survive and thrive towards something better. So tonight, excitingly, you are part of us challenging the idea that time is a flat circle, that history and all our mistakes are bound to repeat themselves. And we are intervening on that cycle with narratives of, yes, environmental destruction, but also environmental equity and stewardship and hope. And before I turn things over to our panelists so they can share those stories, I want to point out But all of these generational bookends that you see here, the span of years, A to B, in which each generation was born, these are not exact sciences. And so the generational start and end points, they really are just tools that help us categorize and analyze our behavior. In fact, one analyst will tell you that millennials are born between 1980 and 2000. And another could put millennials' birth range between 1981 and 1996. So we have chosen to go with the generational cutoffs provided by the Pew Research Center. This is a nonprofit, nonpartisan fact tank. They're also a national leader on demographic and generational analyses. So very quickly, we're going to look at a few of their big findings that contextualize today's conversations, and then we're going to begin with the first stories of the evening. If you hear that noise, that is an emergency Amber Alert. So even now, there are still injustices rife that hopefully we can find some hope with tonight. So firstly, technology. What's brought us all here today quite radically for the first ever virtual Watershed Congress can sometimes be a stigma for our generations. And even though it may seem the older generations are not as tech savvy, the data tells us that the older generations can actually be the fastest moving demographic on Facebook. And yes, Generation Z, the youngest, tend to be the most digital and information literate. But Gen Xers and above are also heavy adopters that are quickly learning the ropes. We also have different generations perceiving very different events in history as being more important to them than others. I'll let you take a moment just to look at this chart and think about how these differ. Gen Z is not depicted because this is still the youngest, most experimental generation. But you will notice that if there was a chart for Gen Z, it likely wouldn't include September 11th as one of the main impacts that most greatly impacted them, because often they were too young for it to have as deep of a personal and profound effect. How do they perceive the link between human activity and climate change? This is deeply important because you can see that millennials are perhaps the most literate environmentally in perceiving the clear link between our human impact and climate. But also, as we go generation by generation, we become more progressively aware of that link. Relative to other countries, the younger generations tend to view the United States as less superior. They're more globally oriented rather than nationally oriented, which is interesting. And in terms of government, the younger generations do tend to perceive government's role as being something that should help us, aid us on a local and global scale. The younger generations, unlike the older ones, don't really think things are best left to the individuals and the businesses. And in today's workforce, you are mostly seeing millennials. And Gen Xers and Gen Z still play major roles as well on either end. But that does not negate the fact that baby boomers are still, despite being surpassed by millennials in the workplace, making waves because they are staying in the workforce longer than most any generation before them, like the silent generation and the greater generation. And they tend to be more educated if they are in the labor force than others their age who are not in the labor force. And all of our generations, all of us, every year that passes, tend to be, with each generation, more progressive on issues like race, gender, sexuality, and immigration, and anything else related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is profound. And of course, and importantly, the millennial generation is perhaps the best educated generation to date. But the post-millennials, Gen Z and beyond, are quickly on track to be the best educated generation yet. When we have the data in the next 10 to 15 years, when they leave high school, continue to enter higher education, we'll really know that. What we do know is that millennials and Gen Z are the most ethnically and racially diverse living generations. And Gen Z takes the cake for diversity. So with that said, with our 5 generations, we have countless stories to hear and grow from. And this evening, we are going to start with our oldest generation, Fred Lewis, who is a retired business manager and active member of the Center in the Park Senior Environmental Corp. And at 92 years old, Fred still provides water quality focused environmental education programs to a number of Philadelphia schools. So Fred, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Fred Lewis, and I'm representing the silent generation, some of my memories of that era with you. I'd like to, for it to be called when coal was king. Back in those days, coal was very popular. And one of the reasons for it was that it could be purchased, obtained at any local corner grocery store and would be purchased in bags. And also, it could be purchased from coal yards that were plentiful in those days in quantities as small as a basket, and also in large quantities as a ton, a truckload. Folks back in those days, there were drivers that made a living going directly to the mines, bringing the coal back to the community and selling it from the truck itself in the community. And that was pretty much called bootleg coal. The many uses were involved industries. It was used in hotels, factories, schools, churches. They all had the boiler rooms and large furnaces that operated by coal in those days. And the homes had the heating too. They had pot-belly stoves for heating in the rooms and furnaces in the basement that would supply central heat. Most any male child, 12 or above, would be familiar with how to, what we call bank the fire. And that would include being able to put enough coal in a fire, not to smother it, but to keep it going for the night, and being able to start it up again in the morning by stirring it without having to start a fire over again from scratch. Was also used for cooking in the homes. And they used to use cast iron for the utensils for cooking. It was heavy and it had held its heat. There was the derivative of coal. It was called coal oil, better known perhaps commercially as kerosene. And the kerosene would be used for lamps and also for small stoves, kerosene stoves, which were considered dangerous in those days. You could very easily knock them over, and it would cause fires in the homes. The kerosene lamps made it convenient to carry light from room to room. One of the big concerns in those days was the fact that there was a huge accumulation of ashes. They didn't exactly know what to do with it. It was decided that one of the best uses would be for landfill, which worked well in those days, but later on it turned out to be came in, as far as the ashes are concerned, it came in two particular grades, hard coal and soft coal. Coal was characteristic that it was able to generate intense heat with a very little smoke. And the soft coal was large, created a lot of flame and smoke, and it had a offensive odor. The downside of coal was the fact that it was very difficult to maintain constant heat. Your homes would be either too hot or too cold. And also the odors were sort of connected with diseases in that particular time. Things like black lung and TB made things very much out of control. And plus the fact that these times were considered the good old days, but looking back, they weren't so good. But I'm happy to have survived them, and I appreciate the privilege of sharing my memory with you. So thank you very much, and I'll be open later for questions.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you.
Sure.
So because Fred has shared that story, it filters beautifully now into the next generation, the baby boomers, for which Eleanor Lundy-Wade is going to present to us now. And Eleanor Lundy-Wade is an active member of the center alongside Fred, the Center in the Park Senior Environmental Corps, where she volunteers alongside Corps members like Fred to provide water quality focused environmental education programs and water quality monitoring throughout Philadelphia. Eleanor, go ahead and share my screen. We are honored to hear your story.
It's not coming up. Okay. Something happened.
All right, so
Okay, I'll just tell you quick.
Well, or Eleanor, why don't we pop to Bethany and you can experiment for a little and see if you can find your PowerPoint, and we'll just pop back to you in a moment. How does that sound?
Okay.
Okay, just because I know you have some really good slides. All right. So Bethany.
Okay, so hi, I'm Bethany, and I'm representing Generation X tonight. And I was born in 1973 in Cleveland, Ohio, and grew up in the first and second ring suburbs. And I grew up half a mile from the beach, and I'm basically going to list a few big deal things that happened during my generation that has commonly shaped my cohort. When I was born, Lake Erie was in big trouble from 100+ year legacy of petroleum and heavy metal pollution in the Cuyahoga River. Smog, acid rain, and lead and gasoline were still huge issues. My parents are boomers. My grandparents were silent generation. And then my great-grandparents were greatest generation. And I also had 3 great-grandparents into my teens, and my eldest great-grandparent died when I was 28. So I had a huge relationship with them that has really shaped kind of who I am as a middle-aged lady. But my dad's parents bought a lake house near Chautauqua, New York, the weekend I was born. So we always joke around that it's my cottage. And I don't get to go there as much as I'd like, but it's literally my happy place. There is an address, and there are some pictures of me up at the cottage there. And I spent most of my time as a kid outside. I was water skiing by the time I was 5. I was snow skiing when I was 2. All of these great, wonderful things that I got to do. But one interesting thing about my generational cohort is that the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act were in effect when I was born. Gen X has not grown up without environmental protection. Nixon was still president, but Watergate was happening while I was an infant. And then the additional big environmental laws that were enacted by the time I was 12 was CERCLA and Superfund. So dealing with the solid waste issue, or beginning to start dealing with those solid waste issues. Title IX was a thing. So it was now illegal to discriminate against sex in education and in sports. So my generation of girls was the first to be able to assume that we had equality with boys. And my family raised its girls and boys to believe that girls and boys are equal. Some of my first big memories include the Iran hostages coming home, John Lennon's assassination, and I also watched the Space Shuttle Challenger blow up in 6th grade on a television screen in my classroom. We did not have emotional support afterwards, by the way. It was a thing, it happened, move on. Acid rain was still the big story, and so was the hole in the ozone layer. My dad is the Maytag man, so we're in refrigeration, and we had to change procedures, equipment, and materials to do his job, which cost us about $40,000 in like 1987 money. It was a big deal. But I also helped my grandmother write the small business grant so that way we could adjust and stay in business. The interesting thing is that there was no thought of saying, no, we're not going to do this. The environment was in trouble, the refrigerants and my hairspray was the problem. And so we just have to do it. So we took the classes, we found the money, and we changed. And then another thing, when I was 11, we took a trip to New York City. And the first time I saw the Statue of Liberty, she was surrounded by smog and in scaffolding because of the 100+ year legacy that was happening of environmental degradation. If you go to New York City today, you very rarely get smog days anymore. And the Statue of Liberty looks beautiful. And another big memory of the time that actually directly affected me was the AIDS crisis. When I was 12, I had to have abscess tonsils removed, and the surgery went okay, but I hemorrhaged during the recovery period. And this was 1985. We knew at the time that the HIV virus was circulating in the blood supply. And we also found out that I have a very rare blood type for my family. So there was no direct relatives who were able to donate to me or donate enough for me to live. So my parents had to make the decision to get the donations from the blood bank. And we can talk about that later, but it did affect my ability to get health insurance later on, which is, I think, a big thing with the environmental thing is also how we do our public health care. But in general, my family was really early adapters to technology. My grandmother insisted in 2004 that we join Facebook, so that way she could keep tabs on us. She didn't like MySpace. I watched MTV from the very beginning. I literally watched the opening day of MTV, and I was 9 years old. We had caller ID the second it became available. And I learned how, as a teenager, to work around that. I also had a Commodore 64 computer when I was a teenager. And although my mom stayed home with us, most of my friends' moms worked. We were very independent as kids. And, we were the kids who, came home when the streetlights came on. But additional big Gen X cohort kind of things, we're huge Star Wars fans. We love our superheroes. We grew up with cable TV, organized sports, music lessons, just say no to drugs, to sex, to everything, which works so well. We also grew up with Iran-Contra, Al Gore and George Bush election results, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the adoption of the internet, lots of boom and bust economies, and vaccines cause autism nonsense. And of course, we fought in the Gulf Wars and in the wars after 9/11, and our kids are still fighting in those wars, including my own. So all of these events really eroded trust in experts. In my generation, we tend not to be joiners, and we look at the world by a very individualistic kind of point of view. It doesn't affect me. It's not my problem. It's all left up. I can't fix it. We also thought everything already was fixed. The environment was getting better. Communism had fallen when we were teenagers. Discrimination became illegal, or so we thought. But we are, as a rule, really, really like convenience, and we really, really like our superheroes. We were overscheduled, free-range kids, and we still are as adults. So how did I get here? I couldn't decide what I wanted to be when I grew up in college, and I still haven't. And I went the traditional route of marriage and kids. And I got divorced when my kids were still all under 6, and I waitressed and I bartended until they were in high school. In 2014, I got the opportunity to go back to school full time, mostly covered, and I was 41. And it's the perfect time for a midlife crisis, and I highly recommend it. My good husband, we've been together now for 15 years, encouraged me, but thought I would do like nursing, respiratory therapy, jobs that we have heard of. And I was like, nope, I don't like sick people. Do not like taking care of sick people. But I did really like science and history, and I really love to read. So I took intro to chemistry and environmental science my first semester at RAC, and I did really well. And I also got the opportunity to become a student ambassador at the Delaware Riverkeepers Watershed Congress. My very first year, and I met all of you awesome people who had actual jobs taking care of rivers. And I found my place and my people. I currently work for the City of Reading Public Works as the Community Outreach and Education Coordinator. I also work out of the Sustainability and Solid Waste Division. So I mostly talk trash, but also water issues and climate adaptation. I'm working on my Master's of Leadership in Sustainable Communities, which is basically public policy. And I'm focusing on climate adaptation at the municipal level because somebody's got to do it, and that somebody might as well be me. So I am going to pass it on to Joey, and I do have to say my kids are the same age as Joey-ish, and they're right on that cusp of Millennial and Gen Z, and I have to say, we raised some really, really awesome kids, just like the generations before raised some really, really awesome kids. And so I'm really excited about what Joey and Samira are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bethany. Before we hop to Joey, I'm actually going to try and go back in time and see Eleanor. Did you manage to find your PowerPoint?
No, I mean,
Oh, no. So for the audience, Eleanor beautifully prepared 15 slides of other just really beautiful pictures throughout her life so they could be big and blown up rather than collage style. Eleanor, let me know if you want to step back and give my cell phone a call and we could let Joey go.
Yeah, do that.
Perfect. All right, Joey, to introduce you for a moment, Joey represents our millennial generation, also known as Generation Y. If you might notice, it goes X, Y, Z. And Joey is the manager of community engagement for the Community and Urban Science Enrichment, or CAUSE Youth Development Program at the Center for Aquatic Sciences at Adventure Aquarium. And he also is a CAUSE program alumni himself with over 15 years experience in marine and environmental sciences. Joey, take things off.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Bethany, that was such a great story. Thank you for that. And I can't wait to hear what everyone else has to say. I'm super excited about that. But we're at Google, cool. So yes, Generation Y, super fun generation. I think what I really appreciated about my generation is the fact that we are a little bit of the best of both worlds, really just thriving on what we've learned from those who came before us, and those who have raised us, and also get a chance to dabble in the same things that Samira will talk about shortly. So the way I like to think of it is we use that letter Y. We have one strand of the old generation and the other strand of the newer generation to make us, right in the smack dab middle. So that's what makes it super awesome. But Just a little bit about me, as Mandy mentioned, I am at the Center for Aquatic Sciences. I get a chance to manage our awesome youth development program, and Samira is one of the awesome teens in that program. And so I work with 8th graders and high school students in the city of Camden. I got lucky to be able to be a part of that program to start back in 2004, and since then I must be doing something right because they haven't gotten rid of me. And so just some of the biggest highlights, yeah, I just threw some pictures here to just kind of give you all of the biggest or some of the more impactful experiences that went throughout my time or our generation that really, I think, just influenced and shaped a lot of the stuff that we do on a regular basis. Uh, generation, the millennial generation, really, if you look at it, has grew up with the explosion of the technology world, right? So on our younger, when we were younger, I can recall as a young kid, being outside was essential. Playing out in front of the house, being with your friends, playing tag, jump rope, riding a bike, going to some of the local areas. But really some of the biggest things that, kept us engaged and entertained on a regular basis. But as time went on, we started to become introduced to we phased out of beepers in a sense. There were beepers, I know that at one point came into play, but then actual telephones started making an appearance. So we started to explore what a cell phone was and how they work and be able to make those phone calls without having to be connected to a cord inside of the house. We then started to see how that started to transform over time. We also started to explore the world of the internet. We know that the internet came pretty much in the generation before us, but it became available to the general public later on during our generation. So being able to learn what Google was, or I can remember, not being able to make a phone call in the house and also be on the internet at the same time. That just wasn't possible. If, I had to make sure I disconnected from the internet so that, my mother or father can answer the phone or to make a phone call, and vice versa. So that became a little bit of a challenge in the house. But technology has become one of the biggest things that you will notice that helped to shape who we are today. So I think that gave us the leverage to, be able to move with time and, keep up with all the current day technology. Being able to connect with all of you easily through Zoom, I think really was able to grow from those experiences in our generation. As far as my connection with the outdoors, I can recall that I didn't have a strong connection to the outdoors when I was younger. Aside from just playing in the parking lot that was right outside my door, I wouldn't going to local parks when I was super young was a thing. As I got older, became a bit more disconnected and a bit more distant. Trails, we didn't, as a family, we wouldn't do trails. Bugs and all the things outdoors were really something that we would just avoid because it was just nasty and gross and dirty. So we don't do that. Playing in dirt, all those things were things that I can recall from my experience, things we avoided because it was just dirty. But more importantly, I think the most influential piece for me, thinking about my experience and where I grew up at, and the generation that I was born into, security, national security was pretty much the biggest priority at that moment. If you noticed, I have a picture of the Twin Towers. 9/11 was a thing that happened during my generation. We also have a host and a list of, just very saddening situations like the Columbine or other really tragic events that took place. And so during my generation, the priority really focused on being able to just make sure that everyone was safe, right, from security, making sure that, we were able to go to the airport and easily get through. And nowadays, it's an entire process just to get through, to get on the plane. Really just, wars started to, we were getting out of some, and there was some trickling in because of some of the events that were taking place as well. And so that was a big thing then. I can also recall that global warming became a big push during my generation. As we started to learn more about what that meant and what that was, that became such a big highlight and emphasis on what we needed to do to try to combat that or figure out what we need to do to address those situations. Is that a pause, Mandy? Sorry.
I was just giving you a quick, like 1 minute or less heads up.
Yep, sure. And so just to speed things up, 20 years later, I'm surprised we're still here because another big issue is that we weren't supposed to be here back in 2000, right? We had Y2K when apparently the world was supposed to end. And at 11:59 on that last day of 1999, things were supposed to go away, right? So all those different things kind of just really, talked about how we would, we didn't have to prioritize most of what the environment dealt with because at some point we thought we weren't even going to be here, right? It was supposed to end. So just to speed things up, essentially security was a big thing. I live in Camden, New Jersey, which at one point was deemed the worst city, the most dangerous city in the entire country. So naturally, because of all these events and because of all these stigmas and all the things that were brought into light, being outdoors and being in the environment, there was a strong disconnect because it was considered unsafe. And so throughout my time being a part of this organization and being a part of opportunities like this, I have grown to learn to appreciate the outdoors. I have been reintroduced to, as you can see, I love to kayak. So I have been reintroduced to the kayaking and other opportunities outdoors simply because it's as time went on and things start to settle and, generations started to form a little bit later on, it became more natural to be outdoors and safer. And learning that it was okay to do those things were a big thing for us. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Joey. Eleanor, we're going to hop back in time now to the baby boomer generation with Eleanor Lundy-Wade, an active member of the Center in the Park Senior Environmental Corps. So thank you greatly, Joey. Eleanor, you may now share my screen or share your screen. You go down to that bottom toolbar, Eleanor. You can click around the middle where it says to share screen. Oh, and you're off mute.
I did, but the PowerPoint didn't come.
Click share screen again. Double click it. Let's find out.
Okay.
Great.
Let's see if we can get it going.
Click escape, Eleanor. Click escape.
Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, perfect. That works too. All right.
My big environmental event was advocating for employees in my union who were asked to move asbestos unsafely. So that's how I actually became involved. So my presentation is called Bookends because the beginning is 1946, the end is 1964, and I'm in the middle. Tide. Did you know it came out in 1946? The University of Pennsylvania created their first computer. It was big and expensive. The United Nations was in upstate New York first, and they decided in 46 that there would be no more nuclear atomic bombs. That's not me, but I'm hooked on books. The community I was brought up in is very proud. And when I learned as a child that people lived there for generations, I vowed I wouldn't. So Philadelphia is my fourth city. That's our phenomenal lady, my biggest influence, my mama. My namesake, Eleanor Roosevelt. My favorite alma mater. And something that was very key to recycling, index cards, card catalog cards. I used to use them for index cards, and also big computer sheets that we used to write letters and do different things on. When I moved to Milwaukee in '77, they were already recycling, even though it wasn't economically beneficial. And in 1962, Pennsylvania's own Rachel Carson sounded an alarm that DDT was eventually going to be big problems. So I suggest everybody read this book. 1964, the Civil Rights Movement. 1964, G.I. Joe. So Barbie has a companion now. And then again, center and apart. When I retired in 15, I thought that I was going to play Scrabble at the center. So I was ecstatic to find out there was a group of seniors who love the environment. So thanks for your patience. I'm done. Ooh, way to go. Way to go. Stop the share. Okay. Okay. I'm done. Where'd she go?
Hi all, I am muted. So you should be able to now see my screen rather than Eleanor's, correct?
Right.
So we have moved all the way from the silent generation, 92 years old, up from Fred, down to the millennials. And so we're so pleased to present to you our fifth panelist today, Generation Z, Samira, who despite still being in high school, is our truest digital native today and an extraordinary student in the Center for Aquatic Sciences flagship program, CAUSE. As a CAUSE program intern, Samira is a year-round leader in her community and the nonprofit sector while helping with aquatic and environmental science program development, research and analysis, community outreach, and so much more. Samira, take it away.
Hello, my name is Samira and I am Generation Z. So about myself is that, you know, over the years I've been growing up, looking back on it, a lot has changed over the world. Like a lot has changed. Like I remember when I was in New York, I was in elementary school. I remember that the Senate, Jesse Hamilton at that time, he was in this big event about Earth Day. So it was like an Earth Day contest for the kids. So in my district, they was pulling out volunteers, you know, with big posters, giving us big posters and giving us a time limit to work on these drawings to show what our representation of Earth Day was. So of course me, the youngest artist like I was like, of course I'll join. And I remember drawing a big earth and talked about pollution and recycling, and I turned it in. And a few years later, because I was actually in middle school when I heard back from Jesse Hamilton, he actually saw my work and he sent out a letter congratulating me on participating into the contest, and he gave me an award for it. And to this day, I still have the letter, but I don't know where it is. And it was like a big moment for me because I actually like felt like I did great, you know, I represented my community well. And it was like so inspiring because they, like, as I got older, they kept on pushing my generation, you know, like, okay, make the earth clean up after yourself. Recycling is good. Make sure you keep that up. You know, we don't want this earth to be bad. And I remember when I was in, I believe, like still in middle school, but almost halfway done, we went to the trip to Washington. And it was my first time in Washington, D.C. And I remember I was looking at the sights, the beautiful monuments, and I was like, wow, this is amazing, my first time traveling. But as I went, as you see the duck picture on my presentation slide, the water was kind of a bit dirty, like really, really, really dirty. But the ducks were swimming in it. So I was like, that's okay, but like, why are they living in this environment like that? Isn't that bad? I mean, that's not pretty healthy. So as I got older, going to the beginning of, before I graduated the 8th grade in middle school, we went on a field trip to like this big park. I mean, when this park was so big, you can get lost in it, literally lost in it. It was like a huge maze. And the teacher was like, okay, y'all go play, be kids, you know, just don't get lost. Make sure you know your way back. They didn't give us a map. They didn't even give us GPS. We was like, okay, we're gonna scatter around, look at the nature and stuff, and we're gonna try to find our way back. And thank God I made my way back. I'm not lost. And the beautiful sight I saw was this river, well, this lake. It was so beautiful. The water was crystal clear, trees everywhere. It was a very healthy environment. You even saw some snakes there too. I tried to, keep my distance there. And I was really inspired that parks like these exist, because I never knew they exist. I never knew like they allow people to roam around big, huge parks, having picnics, barbecue, family gatherings. So I was very like amazed that, a thing like this exists while I'm over here, doing this all day. But like, I remember as a kid, I was more into, like as Joey said, I was more into playing around and going to parks, going wild, running around, not afraid to get hurt, probably got a few boo-boos, still got it patched. And now as I got older, I noticed that my generation as younger, they were more into, going outside than now, when it's all about on the phone, Instagram, Snapchat, or like on a computer, more into that, without not even enjoying what's outside. Like that's really our Instagram, that's really our Snapchat out there, because it's like, it's for free anyways. And as I got older, I started to think, well, I want to give back to the community. I want to know more interests. I want to know what's happening, because I feel like I'm blind. And so that's when the end of my, close to the end of my 8th grade year, Joey came along, hopped in my school. He was like, I believe he was showing an animal. I don't really remember because I was a little bit little. But I remember I was like, wow, an aquarium? Volunteering for an aquarium? That sounds nice. Something different. I wonder if I could feed the fishes, or if I can do this or I can do that. So I joined, and I'm very happy that I joined, because I learned different things. I learned different environments. I learned about different information that I never knew before about the aquatic life, the importance of it, and how it affects our environment. And that was very, very amazing. And during one of our outreaches, I remember we had, it was also about the environment as well. And there was kayaks there, and I presented like a water testing display. And I made this snake display where I took different layers of the snake, and the people could separate them to see what's inside the snake, the body layer, the skeleton, and the organs. And it was really cool that I actually participated and gave back to my environment, and also was able to pass it on to the next generation, like Generation Alpha. And it was very interesting to me. And also, last but not least, I am a proud owner of a turtle named Charlie. I make sure, yes, on the right-hand corner, I make sure I keep him nice and interesting. And I also make sure I take care of him, even though I feel like he needs a job. But yeah, I feel like I actually know that this environment is actually getting better and improving, and I'm very happy about that. As long as Generation Alpha, pass the torch and keep that up, things will just be fine. And that concludes my presentation about Generation Z.
Thank you, Samira. Big thanks. So with all of our generations here, it is now time to turn over to a few prepared questions. And then we are already going to take some questions that are filtering in from the audience. So audience, we want to let you know that we are probably planning to go a little bit past 6 o'clock this evening. All of our panelists are available and keen to continue sharing their stories and experiences. We'll probably be wrapped up closer to 6:15. So if at any point you need to leave around 6 o'clock, we understand, but you are welcome to stay, and we encourage you to stay as we start with prepared questions and then move into the question and answer feature that you're using at the bottom. Again, that's in your toolbar. That's where you can post questions for any of our wonderful panelists that we have this evening. So for starters, Bethany, we did get an excellent question and answer come in, and Bethany has already replied to that question, but I'd love for you, because it's personal to you, to, before I start into prepared questions, to please, to the audience, read the question that was asked to you, as well as your reply.
Willa, and I love your name, by the way. My great-grandmother's name was Wilma, which she hated. But Willa is beautiful. She asked, the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire would have been fairly recent history when you were growing up in Cleveland. How prominent was that event in perceptions of the local environment? The Cuyahoga River fires, the most recent one was 1969. It has not caught fire in my lifetime, which I often have to explain to people, that the river is still not catching on fire. But the famous picture that was on the Time magazine cover was actually from the 1952 fire, because it was more dramatic. So that kind of goes to like how media will shape an argument. But it not only was foundational to my understanding of the environment and our role in it, but I also use the Cuyahoga River fire and also the reversal of the Chicago River in teaching educational or environmental history when I go and speak to especially high school and college groups. My favorite look on everybody's faces, like when I'm talking about it, is the look of what the actual hell. Like, who thought that that was ever a good idea to pump petroleum waste into a river for 60 years? One of the reasons why we use gasoline is because it was originally a waste product, and that was originally what was pumped into the Cuyahoga River. And our good friend John D. Rockefeller, whose money is still doing great things today, but you know, not so great on the environment at the time. He didn't like to waste anything, and so he called up his good friend Ford and said, "I think I have a fuel for you for your combustion engine." And that's why we use gasoline in our cars still today. So I do a lot of legacy teaching, and legacies are good and they're bad, but we have to understand where those legacies came from. But yeah, it, absolutely foundational. But the really cool thing is that when I was a Girl Scout, I got to help do the macroinvertebrate surveys, and discovered, and I was among the first people who found crayfish in the harbor section of the river. And when we're out doing macros, we're like, oh, crayfish. And I always get excited when there's crayfish, because if crayfish are living there, then especially on a really degraded river, then things are moving in the best direction. Eleanor also mentioned Silent Spring, which was also foundational. My grandmother made us read that book when we were 11 or 12.
Oh, good.
But the bald eagles were almost extinct when I was a kid. And because of where I grew up on the lake, surrounded by rivers, I grew up between the Grand River and the Cuyahoga River. Great bald eagle habitat. And so what the scientists were doing at the time is when the eagles would lay their eggs, they would take them from the nest, give them a substitute egg. They would raise the eggs in incubators because the shells were so soft. And one time I had the opportunity, while they were retrieving eggs from an eagle's nest, to actually touch the egg. And it literally felt like Jell-O. So the fact that we have brought back the bald eagles, so they are thriving, gives me hope.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Bethany, you hit on something really important there, and I'd like to hear from Fred and Eleanor. Fred, I know your video is off right now, but you know, we are
having very extreme difficulties.
No, Fred. So Fred, I believe maybe you hit a button at the top where your webcam is, where you might have been able to move if you felt something. If you play around with that button, could be maybe you've hid the webcam. I'll see what I can do, but for now we can hear you. And so Fred and Eleanor,
good.
I can hear you perfectly. So Fred and Eleanor, you know, we'd like to know, what do you feel your generation, how do you have a different outlook, and your generation has a different outlook when it comes to the work that we must do together to build an environmentally equitable and sustainable future? You know, How and do you feel that your generation has a different outlook when it comes to the work we must do together?
I think the biggest thing about my generation is we've seen so many changes in our lifetime. Um, and because of all these changes, we've always been hopeful because we always believed that things would get and be better. So I think that the key for everybody is to not be discouraged by what is going on, but that all of us can come together and work together to make it better.
Yes.
Now, unfortunately, I didn't hear half of your question.
All right. So what I'm wondering, Fred, and yeah, I think that you might be able to get your video on now, Fred. I think I may have solved it as long as you click in the bottom left, if you can find that toolbar. But if not, we can hear you. Do you feel that your generation has a different outlook when it comes to the work that we must do together to build an environmentally equitable, sustainable future? Do you feel your generation has a different outlook? And if so, how?
I don't think we have a different outlook. I think that if anything, your goal may be with the technologies as they are today, they seem to be able to pinpoint your problems better. I would think that back years ago, you were aware of some of the things that needed to be attended to, but your course of action was limited. But nowadays, you have more ways to address some of the problems that we have.
Right. Absolutely. Which actually leads to another question that I have for the group. So anyone, you're all welcome to pop in and answer. We'd like to hear from all of your voices. But what do you feel people got wrong about your generation's relationship with or attitudes towards the environment? And as you think about that, I also invite you to consider what's something that you feel another generation here got right, that you are deeply excited to have been a participant in or to have watched unfold. So either something you think people get wrong about your own generation with the environment, or something you see a generation here represented got right.
I know perhaps some of the things they got wrong.
Yeah. What are you thinking, Fred?
That their activities affected a lot of the changes that we are concerned about. Climate change, for an example. We didn't realize that some of the things that we were doing had some effect on climate change. And consequently, because you didn't think you could do anything about it, it was allowed to, the threat was allowed to increase as far as society is concerned. Now we all are really concerned about climate change and know that some of the things that we can do could help with the threat of climate change. Fires was one of the things we need to need to control fires more. We can control energy. The fact that we are trying to go to electric cars, things that will have less effect on the atmosphere, things like that is things that we can do to help offset the threat of climate control.
Great. Any other panelists have feedback either to those first questions or to what Fred and Eleanor have contributed?
So I think one of the things that I think the generations got right before mine is really just the idea of uh, they all were the ones who created opportunities for the outdoor, right? Who somebody had to sit there and say, hey, we can always have a party indoors, but why not have an outdoor barbecue where we can go to a local park and use this space very differently? They were, generations before us were able to create, develop these recreational uses for these outdoor spaces, which I thought was cool because, I can think of, all right, I like to go sit outside. I like to go sit at the park. I like to go do some of these things. But had it not been for somebody at some point in the past to say, we can use this space for this, that wouldn't be a thing today. So at some point, is somebody creating these spaces to be recreational and creating opportunities for those things are definitely something that I think is worth mentioning for sure.
Thank you. It's an optimist thing, Bethany.
I'm really thankful that really strong regulations, as much as they're a pain in the butt to work in, but there are really strong regulations. The fearful thing for my generation is there is a general kind of thought that we don't need any more, or we don't even need these because everything's okay, when that is not the case. And I'm really fearful. But Gen X is often called the forgotten generation. When I was looking up, things about, generations, there's a whole bunch of boomers, there's a whole bunch of millennials, and if Gen X got a chapter in a book, maybe, like nobody ever likes to talk about us, which is good, because the millennials cannot vote us, and you all should. So I'm looking forward to it. So get out the vote.
Yes. I do want to add one more nod, and that's really a kudos to Gen Z, right? I think there's oftentimes I hear that the newer generation they're just plugged to their phones. They're just connected to technology. And, they are, and I'm admit to some of this, that I want it right now, a type of a mindset, right? Yeah. And yeah. So I think that, it's important to highlight, and I use Samira as an example, is that one thing that they are also very strong on is the idea of being equitable or equality all around, right? Whether that's social equality, whether that's environmental justice of some sort. Like, they are passionate and they are not silent on these matters. And I think the greatest thing that they're also doing is using their platform to make their voices heard, right? So they're taking technology and using it to the best of their ability to make sure that not only is their voice being heard, but it's being heard in many places.
Brilliant. And actually, I think that filters beautifully into something that, any one of you could answer. But I particularly would love to hear more from Samira, and Fred and Eleanor. Your lived experiences could also speak really well on either end of our spectrum of age here and lived experiences. So this question is about the fact that a lot of the opportunities that I certainly enjoy, and that Bethany here has spoken with me about enjoying, are enjoyed because they were hard fought by others, and they are still hard fought today and not enjoyed by many. And so this question is related to climate change and other environmental injustices, because worldwide, having the wrong complexion often does mean having fewer protections. And it's a data-supported reality that issues like climate change, natural disaster, urgent environmental issues disproportionately and have the greatest adverse effects on not just our communities of poverty, but also those communities of color, no matter their income. And so in your experience, what are constructive ways that you think we can treat not the symptoms of environmental injustice, but the disease? How do you think, we can continue to think about those opportunities that aren't being given to everyone in the environmental plane?
I think involvement is critical. Everybody needs to understand they have a stake in it. So it shouldn't be just people of leisure. People that are impacted need to know that they have a voice and they need to be heard. So everybody encourage people to understand that involvement is critical. Because if people just observe from a distance, then they're not directly involved, even if they are impacted. So they need to have a voice and claim their stake in it. Speak up, be involved. And there's a zillion different types of environmental groups. So people can start at home with something, because everything isn't very expensive. There are lots of grassroots environmental groups. So people need to find out what's available nearby and get involved.
If you had to think about those opportunities that you would like to see for the generation behind you, that either you or the generations in front of you have had fewer of, what would those opportunities look like environmentally? Joey.
So not sure if this completely, answers that in a way, or
If
but
I
I think
spark something, go.
it's definitely a connection to Eleanor. It's really just, for having that voice and recognizing that this is something that's very real for everybody. Is thinking about how do we create this connection and make this personal for you. And I think that theme is important because I think in the conversation and on, as the panelists were speaking, they were able to pinpoint why their connection to the outdoors or their connection to these natural resources were important to them, right? Whether it was, Fred talking about coal and Inter going to how it, kept with heating and warming of the homes. Bethany talked about how it was with her family that she did all of these outdoor recreation activities from a very early start. All these things have a personal connection to the individual. And so creating opportunities to continue to make this very real. I know for our organization, we like to, when we work with our communities, is really bringing a highlight to why the Delaware River is so important to our community, right? That's the water that you take a shower with on a regular basis. That's what you drink. That's what you take, you cook with. So, you look at the river and say it's dirty, but yet you use the river. So how do we bridge that gap and make those connections? Because once that happens, I think, Eleanor, a lot more what you said will take place. They will become more advocates to say, this is my water. We need to continue to take care of it because I use it and my family uses it. Things like that.
Samira.
Yes, I totally agree what Joey said and also Eleanor said. It's what people forget to think that, we're all on the same planet. We all breathe the same air. Nobody gets, different certain amounts. We're all being placed on one big planet. So we're all in this together, whether anybody likes it or not. Just like this pandemic. Nobody's over each other. Nobody's living largely or anything. We're all in the same situation. And we need to learn how to work together. That's what will help us thrive. That's what will help us, bring in progress. And I think that, even for those who are afraid to, speak up about it or participate in some things that will help their communities, they should take little steps in it because the little things do count and they do add up. But at the end of the day, they should, even if it's like a small, chat or like a whole group chat or like a, across the neighborhood, say, hey, I think such and such should happen, and that's how things get started. Because as a community, when we talk about things, we want to handle it together, not by like one person, like, okay, I got this idea, I'm gonna try to do it myself. Because sometimes, not all the times, when you're doing a thing by yourself, it tends to be kind of some complications because it's like you're doing it by yourself, not by like a group. Because when compared to a group, you have more ideas thrown at you. You got more like game changers. Like, I'm looking at it like this way, but the person across from me might look at it that way. So it's very important to work together as a whole and as a community, especially like do more programs. Like, especially like, I haven't been camping at all, never been camping, but until I joined cause, I had that experience not one time, but twice. And this is a kid who's afraid of spiders, big spiders. And I've seen them walk across, and I'm like, okay, you stay over there, but I'm gonna enjoy this nature. Because like, being around nature, people like some people's like getaway space, because it's very calming, very relaxing, because it's like, it's just nature.
Yeah.
You know, the leaves, the water, the animals. It doesn't get any wild than that unless you go to Africa, the motherland. But I feel like when people get those opportunities, it's like an eye opener. They get to see the world how it naturally is, without the technology, without everything, the gases, the stuff, just as it is. And I feel like everybody should be a part in that once or twice in their life, or more than one time, because it really changes your mind during certain things. So that's what I think about it.
Thank you, Samira. It changes your mind, and it changes the world. And,
Yeah.
you know, Fred, we have a question for you related to that. And this is for you specifically, Fred. But, you know, we are best able to address these issues and create the same opportunities for connection that Samira is talking about when we work together and making our differences bridges rather than barriers. How have the lessons that you have learned in life so far informed your approach to relationship building across all these generational and intersectional divides? How have the lessons you've learned in life so far informed your approach to this relationship building across our divides?
Now, I didn't hear half of the things you said.
I'm sorry. Was that everyone? Did my internet break up?
It would.
I didn't.
It's breaking up for me, and
I'll read it one more time, Fred. So we are best able to address these environmental issues and build a more sustainable future when we work together. How have the lessons you've learned in life so far informed your approach to relationship building? And this is across the generational divides.
well, I would think that you can't do things by yourself. Things can be best accomplished when it's a group effort, and I think that's the way that we are going to have to solve most all of our problems, is for everybody to get on board and have the same purpose, goal in mind, and not be so divided by so many different notions, suggestions, and things that would prevent you from focusing in on how to solve a problem. So I would think that you have to take advantage of group effort as opposed to trying to do things on an individual basis.
Thank you, Fred. Perfect. You know, I have just one last question for us tonight because we've run a little over on time. And this is for everyone. I'd like to hear something from everyone, even if it's brief, but what advice would you give the generations before or after you about the environment and how we can best address our environmental issues? What advice would you give environmentally for the generations before or after you? Joey?
Well,
You have a quick, go ahead, Fred.
No, I was going to say, my advice is don't put things off. Don't try to say, well, the next generation, they're going to take care of it. Address the problem like it has to stop with you, as opposed to relaxing and saying, I'll do the best I can, but the next generation will have to solve it. So my advice would be to be more deliberate in your efforts to try to find conclusions to some of the problems that are confronting us now.
Brilliant. Joey?
I agree, Fred. And just a quick one-liner: if you treat the earth right, it will treat you right. That's kind of like my
That's a
biggest.
good.
That's my.
That's good.
That's the motto. You treat the world right, the world will treat you right.
I like to say that we need to enjoy it because there's so much to see, so many places to go, and our national parks, even in New Jersey, state parks, things that we take for granted, they're there. We need to enjoy them. And Samira, I hope you'll be a scientist one day.
Close, but kind of mixed as an engineer.
Oh, sure.
Engineers are okay. Not as good as scientists, but okay.
What I would like to say for like the next generation is, don't be afraid to put down your phone.
Yes.
And go out there and be brave, explore, because the earth has benefited you, and it's time to benefit it because it needs you in order to grow even more and provide and thrive.
So I guess I would get to wrap this up. 3 things. I like Fred's thing. The buck stops with us.
Mm-hmm.
The buck stops here, Harry Truman. Also, make sure you vote and you take your friends to vote and you vote in every election, and make sure you pay attention to those local elections because that's where a lot of stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
And also give somebody frequently and often the greatest day ever out on a river or in the lake or in the woods, and show them that love affair. Because if we don't, we're going to be lost. Give them that best day ever.
I want to remind the audience that we're not speaking in intangibles, and we're not speaking of things that are, unfeasible. We're speaking about very constructive things that each and every one of the panelists here tonight do in their daily lives, small changes that do have global impacts. Things like fostering connections between someone in the natural world, things like doing compost out of their own apartment, things like planting trees or small plants wherever their living conditions allow them to. There's these tiny daily life choices that both affect ourselves, affect others, and then affect everyone on a global capacity that are not at all abstract. So, in conclusion today, I hope that we all leave with more hope than hopelessness. We leave with that urgency we talked about at the very beginning, being fueled towards something positive and constructive, and ultimately know that it is only through these intergenerational and intersectional narratives that we can really find our power and continue to move towards anything better. So it is unfortunately time to wrap up our session today, but we want to thank our panelists once again for taking the time to share 5 generations of stories and their hopes for the future during this week of Watershed Congress. And we also encourage you to tour virtually the Watershed Congress's virtual exhibit hall that is still available online. All in one place, you will find more information about our supporters, like the Stroud Center, my organization, and a lot of the organizations represented here with these panelists, opportunities to connect, like what Samira talked about greatly, putting your phone down and getting outdoors, and other resources for your work. And as one last reminder, the recorded sessions, including this one, will be made available on the 2020 Watershed Congress playlist on the Delaware Riverkeeper Network's YouTube channel. So look out in your email for a reminder in the next week when this session is posted there. And finally, we hope this session sparked something new and familiar inside you to continue doing the work, which is far from over. But please check your email or calendar for any additional updates for us. And lastly, have a great evening. Thank you for joining us for the last day of our week-long Watershed Congress. We hope to see you in Pottstown, Pennsylvania in 2021 in person, but if not, we will see you again virtually.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone.
Okay.
And Fred and all, you are welcome to stay for a moment. If you have any other last comments, but I want attendees to know they can pop off the call. Is there any other lingering thoughts as you know, some of our attendees may be popping out right now that you know, oh, I really wanted to get this out and I couldn't quite articulate it today?
I just want to give Samira a hug.
Yes.
And your mama hug too, and tell her that she's raising an amazing human.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, thank you. I actually was partially raised by, well, mainly raised by my grandma, you know. Give that.
Your grandmother's raising an amazing human. Yeah, my grandmother's made it a big difference in my life as well. But
consider this after the credits roll. You know,
yeah, but
for a second.
Yeah, so next time you're mad at your grandmother, remind yourself that she's raising an amazing human. Give her a break.
A question we didn't get to was what gives you hope? Samira. Very
yeah.
good.
I would just like to express my appreciation for being on this particular program. It's an exciting experience to be involved in this kind of technology. And I feel as if what we are doing today is on the cusp of what's going to be taken for granted in the future. And I just feel privileged to have been a part of it. This is so far from how I expected my life would be at 92 than it actually is. So it's my pleasure and a privilege to be with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Fred, I'm really hoping, since you get to do video calls now, like, you know, where it's on the Jetsons, that I get to do the flying cars finally when I'm 92. All the things you've seen.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
The way the world has changed over my lifetime.
Yeah.
It's been a journey, and
yeah. The only thing constant is change.
Over yet.
Yeah.
16 to 92, we all survived Zoom and a virtual wild west of this Congress. So Fred, it is our privilege that you, Eleanor, and everyone on this team are here in one piece, and I can still see your face and hear your voices. So thank you.
It's amazing.
No, you know, Fred, at work,
back.
At work, when I'm talking to the old people who tell me that they can't do this or they can't do that, I'm gonna be like, I was just at a conference, a national conference, with a man who was 92 and he rocked the technology. So don't tell me you can't do this.
100%.
Right? Seriously, I used to do it, like my grandmother made sure I had internet when we moved to Pennsylvania so we could Skype her.
Okay.
Yes.
Like, don't tell me these old people can't do technology. They invented this shit.
Well, we're gonna edit that part.
Hey.
All right. But while we're on that note, same with the young folk. I mean, you know, we have generations here who are constantly being told, like Samira's, that they're too connected to a phone and technology and not connected to the world. And they are able to use those technologies as the vehicle to connect with the world and be the most information and digitally literate and pull off conferences like these well into the future. So this whole evening's been an honor. Well, we will wrap it up for real, I think, now.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure any other comments you had, I wrung out the rag. Any last? All right.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you. Everyone have a great night.
And a great weekend.
And a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.